Whew. We just had a bombshell drop, everybody. The case against Tracy Murphy, a sanctuary owner in upstate New York, who was charged with larceny for taking in 2 stray cows on July 16, 2022, after 2 years after cattle ranchers, tycoons, 100 plus people standing outside her home screaming, lock her up, death threats, Congress people condemning vegan extremism in this local community after so much power and influence going after her, trying to tear down this one woman who's just trying to take care of 2 stray cows. Yesterday, we won. The charges were dismissed. And it's a pretty mind-blowing victory in a lot of ways, but it also is an incredibly insightful victory on 2 important issues that I feel like every American, not just animal advocates, should understand. One is how to fight for your constitutional rights, because if Tracy had not fought for her constitutional rights, if her lawyers, including me, had not moved to vindicate her constitutional rights, we would not have the victory today. But the other reason this is an important victory is because it stands for a crucial proposition in the right to rescue and animal rights, which is that even against enormous power, when you're trying to give aid to a sick, injured, or stray animal, you can win. And I think that's part of the reason. In fact, I think it's an essential part of the reason why this case was dropped yesterday. So for those of you who don't know what's unfolding, on July 16th, 2022, over 2 years ago, Tracy Murphy, who is a friend of mine, she's a great person. She is the owner of a farm sanctuary called Asha's Farm Sanctuary in Defame, New York. She came home after getting some coffee. I think she went to Tim Hortons to grab some coffee, vegan coffee. Don't worry, she's one of us. And she's rolling up to her home, and she sees 2 cows wandering into her property. So these are both young cows, juvenile, and they seem like they're interested in her herd of cows because she's got a herd at her sanctuary. There's an extremely busy road outside of her sanctuary called Coomer Road, where cars are driving like 55, 60 miles an hour, very fast. And so it's dangerous for these cars to be wandering around near a road. But thankfully, they get away from the road and they walk up into her pasture or next to her pasture, and they're looking at her cows and mooing and mooing and mooing. It's a hot summer day. July in upstate New York is extremely hot. There are these cars that are extremely dangerous. And Tracy's Sanctuary is a place that actually literally takes in stray animals that are abandoned, abused, or injured. In fact, the authorities on multiple occasions have actually brought animals to Asha's Farm Sanctuary when they're stray, when they're abandoned, when they're in a cruelty case. So some examples. In 2016, there were a few dozen animals that the SPCA, which is law enforcement in Niagara County, found literally starving to death. In some cases, the animals were already dead. Many of them were emaciated, and you had cows that were basically bony and not being given any food. So they're trapped in these shelters and pens where they're just not given food and they can't escape, because these domesticated farm animals, they're not like their wild counterparts. A wild cow in Africa can leap fences, can smash through obstacles. A wild pig in Asia, where they were domesticated, is an extremely aggressive animal that can smash through a gate and attack people who are trying to stop them from escaping. But these animals are gentle, innocent, big babies, essentially. And this is a scientific process called neotenization. Over the last 10,000 years, we've bred these animals to be very docile, innocent, in many ways helpless. And this particular farmer had taken these helpless animals and trapped them in pens where they were starving to death. I've seen some of the photos and videos, and you see a pig in this shed where there's literally garbage everywhere. Just, the shed is actually kind of partly collapsing on itself. And it's not clear what it is, but there's poop and feces and filth building up to the point that the pig is almost like literally drowning in his own feces, it appears, or her. I think her name was Ruthie. And so the SPCA comes and takes these animals and says, you can't do this, and charges the guy with cruelty. But now they have a few dozen animals, and the local shelter does not get any public funding to rescue any animals except dogs. So they've got a few dozen starved animals. They have to retain these animals as evidence. And this is going to be key. It's going to come up in Tracy's case. But they have to retain these animals as evidence against the guy who starved them. And they have nowhere to take them because literally, You got an emaciated cow. I mean, a cow at adult weight, 2,000 pounds. Also, this is very important. 2,000 pound Angus steer, 2,000 pound Angus heifer. An adult cow, you'll learn why. The weight of an adult cow is important in just a moment. But you got this 2,000 pound cow, but because they're starved, maybe it's 1,000 pounds, like literally just emaciated, just almost like a concentration camp survivor. They need to retain them. They need to get them back to health. I mean, it's not appropriate to kill them because these are cruelty victims. Where do they go? Well, they go to Asha's farm because Tracy has always stepped up and helped the community. So the SPCA, we're going to present evidence in court that the SPCA on multiple occasions, and not just Niagara County, but Erie County, other counties, called Asha's farm up and said, look, we don't have any money to handle these animals. Frankly, our pens can't even fit these animals because our pens are for dogs. We cannot fit an 800-pound cow or a 400-pound pig. And, even at 400 pounds, just for the record, a farm pig is very, very starved at 400 pounds because at adult weight, these are 800-pound giants. Innocent, gentle, helpless giants, but they're giants. And Tracy, without any hesitation at all, says, yeah, I'll step up. I'm going to take them in. I don't want to see any animal hurt. I want to help our community. Don't worry about any funding. Don't worry about anything. Just give them to me. I don't want to think about any animal suffering. I'm going to take them in. And this is just one of many occasions where Tracy has stepped up over the last decade at her sanctuary to help the local community. There's another example she shared with me, and I've seen some of the photos and videos of this, which are quite grim, where in a domestic violence incident, this guy who was, I think, going out of his mind and attacked his partner or his girlfriend. Not entirely clear because I didn't actually find the details of the actual domestic violence case. But the important point for our purposes is, in addition to attacking his partner, he attacked our animals. And she had a flock of chickens she was caring for, and the guy just starts stabbing the chickens. And a lot of them are just stabbed to death. And it's just this bloody scene of mayhem at this woman's home. The guy's arrested, ends up getting, actually, again, I haven't seen the criminal paperwork. My understanding he was charged with domestic violence and animal cruelty as well. But once again, they've got all these chickens. And again, the pound has this scene now that they have to deal with all these stabbed to death animals, including some who are, traumatized by and injured and beaten by this man who's just gone mad and brutally assaulted both a human being and animals. And they don't know what to do because they have no space for chickens. They don't even have chicken food. What are they going to do? They don't even know how to take care for chickens. So once again, they call Asha's Farm sanctuary. And what does Asha's Farm do? They don't say, we need a contract, give us some money, or please, what you're going to have to give us a grant. I mean, Tracy didn't say any of those things. She didn't pause it for one moment. She just said, bring them here. I will take care. And that's just kind of the sort of person she is. She's an amazing human being. And I know people at sanctuaries like her. And Tracy's a very special person, but there's a lot of people out there at sanctuaries, and maybe you're one of them, I've said before, a lot of people laud me and the people I work with for doing these rescues. And the reality is the hardest job in the movement is the sanctuary work, because we spend maybe one day, maybe a couple of weeks at most with the animals, and some extremely rare occasions I've been with animals for a couple months. But it's a sanctuary that has to take care of these animals the rest of their lives, who takes in an abused, injured, abandoned animal, an animal who's been traumatized by a man stabbing them or stabbing their friends and family to death, an animal who's been trapped in a pen where feces is up to their neck, and they're almost drowning in waste, and there's, the shelter is falling apart, and wooden planks and garbage is falling into their enclosure, and it's almost like they're being trapped in some sort of horror movie trap. They're going to be collapsed to death, and they have to try and nurse these animals back to life and give them a sense of safety and love and respect. And they have to do that potentially for years. And that's a hard job. And Tracy's one of the people who's willing to take that job at zero benefit to themselves, and made incredible sacrifice to themselves. But let me correct myself. It's not zero benefit, because one of the things I know Tracy and other people who run sanctuaries, including Gene Bauer, who's actually going to testify as a witness in this case, the founder of Farm Sanctuary and the founder of the Farm Sanctuary movement. I know Gene would say this too, is it's not no benefit, because there's an immense spiritual benefit. When you take into your hands the life of a being who has no other hope, and you nurse that being back to life, it transforms your sense of the possible in profound and powerful ways. And I think that's what's happened with Tracy in the case of these rescues. And that's the same mentality. That's the same philosophy. That's the same emotional reaction that Tracy felt when she saw these cows wandering onto her property in July of 2022. She knew these animals had found a home. And so she gave them that home. And for the record, Tracy is not a radical confrontational activist. Whatever you think of my work as an open rescue activist, it is very different from what Tracy did on July 16, 2022. All she did was opened her home up for 2 stray animals who needed food and water and shelter. And for that, she was ultimately charged, jailed, shackled, attacked by a local congresswoman who condemned vegan extremism, by a livestock tycoon named Forrest Lucas, who attacked her as a vegan extremist. And after 2 years of attempting to incarcerate her, yesterday their case fell apart. So let's go into that next. What exactly happened and why did the case fall apart? Well, on July 16, 2022, Tracy takes in these cows into her sanctuary. And immediately she does a lot of things that, frankly, a lot of animal advocates probably wouldn't do. So, for example, she calls the SPCA, which is local animal control. The SPCA technically does not have any legal authority over animal control other than for dogs, because there's no funding for any animals other than dogs, not even cats. I was kind of shocked to hear this from the executive director, who's an amazing human being named Amy Lewis. Really, really incredible public official, someone with immense integrity who I really respect, because she was straightforward and honest with us throughout this process. But even though Amy and her team do not have public funding for anything other than dog control, handling stray dogs, they have, as a service to the community, taken on the role for the entire county of Niagara for all animals, cats, pigs, and cows. And there have been multiple occasions where law enforcement finds some farm animal, such as the case of Ruthie the pig, where law enforcement or some citizen calls them in and says, "We have an injured, stray, abused animal. We need your help." And the SPCA tries to help. And one of the ways they try to help is just placing these animals in an appropriate home. And so Tracy had this prior experience with the SPCA. She knew they were the appropriate party to call. She knew that they cared for the animals and wanted to ensure they weren't cruelly mistreated. And so she reported them. And the key thing is, if you're calling animal control and saying, "I found 2 stray cows," and for the record, Tracy didn't want to see them sent to slaughter, but she told them, that the SPCA investigator who came out immediately, she said, "I think these cows are meant to be here. If you can find the owner, I would love to negotiate some sort of sale." Because whoever owned the cows was going to send them to slaughter anyways. It was a purely commercial transaction for them. And Tracy assumed, sensibly, that given that by the time the investor came around, she had had the cows for about a week. By the time that the owner came around and visited the sanctuary, and I'll say more about that in just a moment, because the key fact here is the owner was a state trooper for the New York police. It was 10 days into her care for these animals. And all of us have had the experience of having a stray cat or dog. Not all of us, but many of us have had the experience. Or no, maybe I should say all of us. I think all of us have probably at least seen a stray cat or dog and had some sort of emotional connection. And some of us have had the experience of seeing a stray cat or dog. I've certainly had this experience. And I took in a mother cat and 7 of her kittens, and it changed my life. Where you see a stray animal and you immediately feel this emotional connection. You see their vulnerability, you see their need, you see, in many cases, their love in a way that seems inexplicable and almost miraculous, because we're these big hulking creatures. Humans are the most horrific animal abusers in the history of the planet Earth, and yet somehow they still trust and love us. And that's what happened to these 2 cows. She quickly named this black heifer, about 700 pounds, Little Willow, because she had another cow at her sanctuary called, whose name was Willow, who was about twice as big, maybe 3 times as big. And she said, "Oh, little baby, we'll call her Little Willow." And she named the other calf Ishmael, after one of her employees who had recently had to leave for various reasons I won't get into here. But I think he had to leave the country. And they had very different personalities. Like little Ishmael was very excitable and ran around a lot and was, always interested and curious about what's going on. And then Ishmael was very kind of reserved and needed to be protected and would follow Little Willow around and like kind of be, it's kind of interesting because I've had this experience too, and it just teaches you how unique every individual animal is. But steers are usually considered more aggressive. They're the ones, like for example, if you're at a sanctuary, people always warn you about the steers. They say, they got horns, and Ishmael had horns. They're bigger, they grow faster, they got all this testosterone, they're going to be more aggressive. Little Ishmael is the opposite, from what I understand. I've seen some of the video of him, and it's true. Like he's like a big baby, and then he'd like follow Little Willow around. You got this little, female calf, and then you got the steer with horns, like following the little calf around, just going, "Ooh, what's going on?" Like he really kind of depended on Little Willow for protection, I think, and for safety, and eventually on Tracy too. There's an immediate bond where you have this rambunctious calf who is excited and connects with Tracy because they're having fun together. Tracy's giving her food, and they're developing like a playful relationship. And then Ishmael is the one who's more reserved and needy, and initially feels like, okay, I don't know everybody, but and I bet Ishmael just came along because Little Willow was leading him. Because Little Willow ran to this sanctuary and thought, we're lost, we're scared, there's these cars driving around, it's hot, we're hungry. Oh, there's some cows over there, let's go here. And Ishmael was probably like, no, I don't want to go anywhere. Can I just stay here? And eventually kind of got dragged along because he was the needy one. But the point here is, regardless of whether the descriptions I'm making are exactly accurate, a lot of us have had these experiences where we run into these animals who unexpectedly transform our lives. And this is what happened to Tracy. She ran into these 2 cows and just instantly connected with Little Willow and saw how playful she was, how she was running around and kind of leading the pack, even as like a baby heifer. A heifer is a female cow who's never been pregnant. And then you have Ishmael, this cow, steer with the big horns, following Little Willow around and just like, like sneaking around and feeling a little anxious about things, but eventually growing into the situation, realizing, okay, it's okay. No one's going to hurt me, and I got my sister here. And so things are going to be okay. So she cares for these cows, but she calls the SPCA and says, this is the situation. And then on July 22nd, about a week after the cows show up, the SPCA sends in an investigator. His name's Dan Maltby, who comes in, checks it out. Tracy openly welcomes him in, says, feel free to take any photographs of the cows. And by the way, if you find the owner, let them know I'm interested in purchasing them because I've had a connection with them now. And the important point here is, interestingly, New York law protects companion animals differently than other domesticated animals. In particular, it is aggravated cruelty in the state of New York when someone unjustifiably kills a companion animal. And a companion animal is defined as any domesticated animal who lives in or near your residence and is not being used for commercial purposes. Actually, let me get the exact definition of companion animal because I don't have it in front of me. So bear with me, everyone, on the podcast. Definition, animal cruelty, New York. I'm going to pull this up real quick. All right, consolidated. So the definition of companion animal means any domesticated animal normally maintained in or near the household of the owner or person who cares for such other domesticated animal. And that is very important. A companion animal means any domesticated animal who's maintained in or near the household of the owner. So it either can be the owner or a person who cares for such domesticated animal. And why is this important in Tracy's case? Because she is a person who cares for an animal who lives at or near her home. Her sanctuary is her home. I've seen where she lives, and the pasture is right outside. And so she's caring for these animals. And in particular, if someone kills a companion animal, it is aggravated cruelty. So a person is guilty of aggravated cruelty when, with no justifiable purpose, he or she intentionally kills a companion animal, right? So when you kill a companion animal, when you kill a domesticated animal living at or near someone's residence, and this does exclude livestock animals, so I should say, the definition of companion animal, a pet or companion animal should not include a farm animal as defined in the section, right? But the fact that an animal was once a farm animal does not make them permanently a farm animal, right? So if you look at the definition of farm animal, it means any ungulate species of capital, sheep, swine, goat, as defined in another section of law, which is raised for commercial or subsistence purposes, right? So a pet or animal does not include an animal raised for commercial or subsistence purposes, but when an animal is no longer being raised for subsistence or commercial purposes, in other words, raised to eat them or to profit from them, they're no longer a farm animal. They now become a companion animal under the law. And that's what these cows were. When they come onto someone's property and they form a connection with someone, and they are no longer being treated as an object for money or for food, this animal becomes a companion animal. And so when Tracy asserted to Dan Maltby on Friday, July 22nd, that I would like to make a purchase for these animals, it wasn't just that she had an ethical right, an ethical claim on these animals, given the connection she had, given that hopefully we can all agree that no one should kill anyone else's pet, anyone else's companion animal. I mean, that's been in the national news because of the Trump debates, which is a little bizarre. Everyone's complaining and protesting about how Haitian immigrants are allegedly eating people's pets, and they're not realizing people are eating animals just like pets all over the world, all over the country right now, including J.D. Vance and Donald Trump. In fact, Donald Trump sells beef taken from animals who are just like our dogs and cats at home. But setting aside that national controversy, in this particular situation, Tracy had a claim that these animals were companion animals, and therefore killing them would be a felony in the state of New York. But there were a couple other points. One is that for a shelter or sanctuary to act responsibly, they need proof of ownership before they release the animals. Right? So if you take in a stray Chihuahua, for example, and someone comes to your door and says, I lost my Great Dane. Can you give me your dog? I heard you found a dog. Give me that dog because I lost my Great Dane. And you turn around in your house and you look and you see this little Chihuahua that's shivering and looks abused. And you look out to this guy who's saying he lost his Great Dane. You look back to the Chihuahua. You look back to this guy and say, can you tell me again what kind of cow or dog you have? And he keeps saying, I got this Great Dane. Give me that dog. Give me your dog. You're not going to turn the dog over. That's preposterous because the person's asking for a Great Dane and the dog you found in the Chihuahua, right? So you need proof of ownership. And we're going to have Gene Bauer and others testify about this requirement. Also, a local lawyer named Matt Albert, who actually ultimately consulted with Tracy on a pro bono basis to help her out in this situation. So, she told Dan Maltby, in the SPCA, not immediately, but eventually, that, someone can provide some proof of ownership. I'd love to have a transaction with them and make sure these cows can have the permanent home that they found for themselves. And so Dan's like, yeah, sure, that makes a lot of sense. Let me go find, I'm going to go and try and find out who the property owner might be. And he goes and just contacts a few community members, and it turns out there's a guy a few houses away. This is a rural agricultural county, who says, oh yeah, I lost 2 cows. I think they're probably mine. And so Dan puts this guy, his name is Scott Gregson, in touch with Tracy, and contacts his supervisor, Amy Lewis. Gregson then immediately calls Tracy and says, yeah, I got these 2 cows. I heard you found them. I'd love to come out and check them out. Can you hold all of them for the weekend so I can come on July 25th? And Tracy says, sure. Yeah, absolutely. And Tracy also says, I'd love to work out, if you can provide proof of ownership, I'd love to work out a deal. And also, I've consulted a lawyer in light of the fact that I've had these cows, and this is an important point too, for about a week. There's a New York law saying you have a possessory interest in a cow, even setting aside whether this cow is a companion animal. You have a possessory interest in this cow under lien law 183 and town law 310. When you've cared for an animal, when you have put your sweat, your tears, your money into an animal, including a livestock animal, you actually have a legal claim to hold on to those animals until you've been compensated for your costs, which makes sense. It's kind of a terrible comparison because a cow is not a car, but it's like a mechanic's lien where if you go in, your transmission's shot in a car. And, like I've got a 2009 Honda Civic. It's a pretty old car. Say my transmission gets all messed up. I have to take it into the mechanic. Transmission is really expensive to replace. They spend $4,000 replacing the transmission. The car, frankly, isn't worth $4,000. The car is worth like $1,000. They put $4,000 into this car, and then I come up and I say, "Give me the car," and they say, "Oh, you haven't paid. I spent $4,000 in the transmission." And they say, "Give me the car." Wait, you haven't paid me. You said you'd pay me, and I just spent $4,000 fixing the transmission. And the guy says again, "Just give me the car." You don't have to give the car back. In fact, you legally cannot give the car back in many cases, or you lose your lien. You lose any claim, because the moment you release the car back, it is deemed as having satisfied all obligations and any possessor interest you have. And for Tracy, it wasn't really about the money. It was just about her legal claim to the cows. To the extent she had a legal claim to the cows, she was advised by her attorney, Matt Albert, correctly, by the way, that she had a legal right to hold on to them until all debts had been addressed. And further, if she released the cows, she would have no legal claim to them at all. The moment she gives the cows back, they're just gone. They can be sent to slaughter. They can be shipped off to California. You have no idea what's going to happen to them. And so her lawyer advises her, tell them about this lien. Tell them that you have to hold on to them, under the law, or you lose the right to this lien. And that what you'd really like to do is just, if he is the owner, if he can provide proof of ownership, get a secure deal, a settlement whereby the cows can stay here and you pass some money along. And so that's what Tracy does. She shares with Scott Gregson all these details. And apparently Scott Gregson is not happy, which, happens all the time. Sometimes you bring your car to a mechanic and you're not happy with the outcome, and that's fine. It's a dispute about payment that can be addressed in a court of law. But the difference in this case is that Scott Gregson is not just a normal citizen. He is a state trooper for the New York police. And Tracy doesn't know this. And so when Scott Gregson shows up on July 25th, 2022, he tells her, "Oh, yeah, no problem. You got a lien. I'll bring some money. Proof of ownership, no problem. I'll show up with proof of ownership." And Tracy says, "Yeah, and by the way, can you just let me know when you're going to come? Because, Tracy's a woman who lives alone. She's in her 60s. She's a private person, sensitive person, introverted person. She doesn't want some just barging into her property with no notice." She says, "Just give me a call and let me know when you're going to come," which is a normal thing to do. When you're going to come and try and work out a deal with somebody, normally you tell them, give them a heads up and say, like, "Oh, yeah, I'll be there at 10 a.m. We'll be there at 11 a.m. Is that okay?" You don't just show up at someone's property and knock on the door and start demanding things. But Gregson does none of those things. He promises three things. One is, "I'll call you before I come and let you know when I'm coming." Two is, "I'm going to provide proof of ownership." And three is, to the extent you incurred any costs, and she had incurred costs, there had been damage to the property, they'd pooped everywhere, they had eaten a bunch of hay, she had done a bunch of veterinary consultations, including with Cornell University, which is the top veterinary school in the country, which you have to do when you have a stray or animal of unknown origin arrive at your sanctuary. You've got to do a health check. So for all the costs, he said, yeah, we'll talk about, some costs. And really, like I said, Tracy was mainly asserting this because she knew she had a possessory interest in the cows, a legal claim to the cows, but she had to assert her rights under the lien, not to get money out of this guy, but because just she wanted to make sure that her legal right to the cows would not be exhausted, would not disappear because she relinquished her claim to the lien. And so Gregson makes those three promises. One, I'm going to tell you when I'll come. Two, I'm going to provide proof of ownership. Three, I'll bring money through which we can work out a deal. And he does none of those things. Instead, he shows up with a state police officer, a man with a gun. She shows up with a big truck and trailer unexpectedly, Another man, unknown, I still don't know who this other man was, but there's another guy with him in the truck. He brings his wife and kids and a video camera for some reason. It's weird, right? You're going to negotiate the release of some cows. You bring your wife and your kids who are holding a video camera and keep shooting your little kids and the interaction. Again, all with no notice, no expectation. And then importantly, he also brings a representative from the SPCA. And here is the important thing. That representative was not authorized to be there, was violating direct orders and SPCA policy by being there, because the SPCA handles cruelty cases. They can't handle stray animal cases. If a case is not a cruelty case, and there was no allegation of cruelty in this case, there was no allegation Tracy mistreated the cows. It was no longer a stray animal case because the cows were no longer wandering around the streets endangering the roads. The SPCA had ordered all their officers not to be involved. And at that weekend, Tracy had consulted with a local attorney who's a vegan. He's an activist. He's also a former prosecutor. Great guy, really sharp guy. Matt Albert. Love this dude. Hung out with him about a year ago. And he's got a great property out in east of Buffalo and rescues dogs himself. So great guy, but also extremely experienced in animal custody cases. Again, he's the one who would advise Tracy, hold on to these cows. Don't give them up. He had actually called the SPCA because he worked with them and explained to them the situation. And the SPCA had indicated this is a civil ownership dispute. There's now, a disagreement between two parties as to who appropriately should count for these cows, what money should be exchanged. They should just work it out between the two of them. If it's got to go to the small claims court, great, but they can work it out. Yet somehow, even though the SPCA and the executive director ordered all their officers, you are not to be present there. We're out of this case on Friday, July 22nd. Somehow on Monday, July 25th, Scott Gregson shows up not just with a state police officer, without telling Tracy he's going to do that, but also with an SPCA representative named George Reinhardt. And it turns out George had been duped. There had been someone at the SPCA working to undermine Amy Lewis, a gentleman by the name of Eric or Rick Salisbury. And his name is going to be important in a few moments. But he had been working behind the scenes to undermine the SPCA's policies, to undermine the law in direct violation of his boss's orders that this is not a stray animal case or an animal cruelty case. We are not involved any longer. To work with the state police, because he was buddy-buddy with a lot of officers, including possibly Gregson. And the reason I say possibly is because apparently there were a number of text messages exchanged on that weekend between Rick Salisbury, and Scott Gregson about sending an SPCA officer to come with Gregson to seize these cows. Again, without Tracy's knowledge, she just thinks, yeah, this is still, it's still basically a friendly negotiation. We're just trying to figure out, how we can find a resolution that allows me to love these cows and treat them as the companion animals they are, and allows you to feel like your ownership rights have not been completely eviscerated. But instead of that, Gregson corruptly and inappropriately reaches out to the SPCA, convinces one of the officers to violate the SPCA's own policies in a direct order from a boss, and secretly have one of their agents present. Not only present, but convinces one of them to say that he's going to execute a search warrant, that he will seek a search warrant to raid Tracy property against SPCA policy, against a direct order from the boss to seize these cows, even though Tracy has a claim on them, even though, importantly, when Gregson shows up on that day, to the SPCA, to the state police officer, and to Tracy herself, he doesn't provide proof of ownership. He doesn't provide any money to cover the lien, and he inappropriately brings an officer of both the state police, which is his agency. He is a state police officer, and he brings another state police officer, and an SPCA representative who's inappropriately present in violation of his duties as an SPCA officer and a representative. And somehow, even though we requested all the communications to figure out what the heck happened on that day, July 25th, 2022, all the text messages magically disappear. They're just gone. They're gone. Who knows where they went? And you might think, wow, this is so corrupt. How could this get so broken and so ridiculous? And it gets even worse. So over the last 2 years, we have been prying and probing and asking for every bit of evidence regarding how this all unfolded. Why did this escalate so quickly? If you remember that Will Ferrell clip from Anchorman, where I think there are two people having like a minor disagreement, and then they start stabbing each other. Suddenly, it's like, and Will, oh no, I remember what it is. There's a bunch of journalists from different television stations who all gather in a public parking lot just to discuss. They're having a little powwow about how does your station approach news reporting. Well, my station approaches news reporting this way, and the other station says, well, we approach it this way. And suddenly they bring out all these guns and weapons and start stabbing each other. It's a comedy, so it's very juvenile and kind of comic the way it unfolds. Don't worry, it's not at all grim because it's ridiculous. It's like Steve Carell. Steve Carell somehow gets he just pulls out this, I think, ball and chain and is like swinging around over his head and like smashing people. And at the end of the scene, Will Ferrell's patching himself up and he says, that escalated quickly. And it just feels like that. It's like, geez, that escalated quickly. How do you get armed men and the SPCA corruptly involved? And this escalation to the point where, people are seeking search warrants. And for the last 2 years, we've been trying to get an answers as to how this happened. And not only did we not get the text messages, but 3 days ago, on October 1st, we find out the real explanation for how this unfolded. Not only is Scott Gregson a state police officer, and of course, when he comes to seek these cows, he's not coming in his capacity as a state police officer. He can't say, I'm a state police officer, hand over that property, because that would be a profound corruption of his ethical duty to not use his public office for personal benefit. You cannot, as a police officer, use your public office to bully someone in a civil case, in some sort of civil dispute. But it turns out the officer assigned to supervise the investigation and ultimate arrest and raid, which I'll tell you about in just a moment, in this case, is Scott Gregson's brother-in-law. His brother-in-law. And we learned this 3 days ago, on the eve of a trial, 2 days before this trial is supposed to start. The prosecution discloses to us, I suspect because they knew this would come out in cross-examination, which it would have. It absolutely would have. And it would have been the grounds for an immediate dismissal or at least a mistrial. You cannot have a trial. And the reason this is important is because that also violates the law. Public Officers Law 74 indicates you cannot use a kinship relationship to obtain some privilege in public resources or public access. So you cannot use public resources. So, for example, if I am a tax auditor at the IRS, I cannot call the IRS and say, hey, can you have my brother handle my case? And lo and behold, your brother says, oh, you don't have to pay any taxes at all. Guess what? You're a billionaire, but you don't have to pay a penny of taxes. You can't do that. It's illegal. It's totally illegal. If you're accused of a crime, you can't call up the police and say, like, hey, my dad's a sergeant. Can you have him handle my case? And suddenly you just murdered 5 people, and the sergeant who's handling the case says, oh, no, actually, we have no evidence of a crime. Can't do that. That's illegal. Your dad cannot be involved in your criminal case. In this case, we have the brother-in-law of Scott Gregson as the supervising officer who's signing off on all the raids, the arrest warrants, all these things, and involved in this case. And this is disclosed 3 days before the trial. Okay. And that's why all this all unfolded, in my view, that you have this undue influence by a man on his brother-in-law. So what happens? As a result, this senior officer, his name is Thomas Gibbons, and we had no idea because we got a list of names of officers who are involved, which you're legally required to provide when you're prosecuting a case. You have to provide to the defense attorneys all the witnesses who are involved in the arrest or witnessed the arrest. And we just saw a number of names. Gregson and Gibbons do not seem at all related to one another. We had no idea there was this kinship relationship. But what happened is, because Gibbons is running this case, when Gregson and a trooper named Andrew Mazurk show up on July 25th, they initially don't have a search warrant. They don't have any legal grounds for being there at all. Tracy tells them repeatedly, look, can you please talk to my attorney? You're trespassing. Can you not leave my property? They refuse to leave. They continue to harass her. They intimidate her. And eventually they give up, like 15 minutes later, and leave and say, we're going to seek a search warrant now. Immediately, I think within hours, possibly within minutes, Matt Albert, great attorney who leapt to action, calls Gregson, he calls Mazurk, and explains to them, look, you need to provide proof of ownership. My understanding is you promised to provide proof of ownership, and in fact, that even again on that day, on July 25th, Scott Gregson says, when Tracy reasonably asks him, do you have proof of ownership? His response is, oh, yeah, no problem. I can do that. And he doesn't provide it. He doesn't provide anything. He doesn't provide a description. He just says, give me those cows. It's like a random person just walking up to your house and you found a stray dog, suspicious guy who comes with a bunch of other dudes unexpectedly, surprising you with an officer, with an SPCA rep, without any sort of explanation at all, and says, give me those cows or give me that dog, right? Doesn't provide proof of ownership. It doesn't provide any money. Tracy asked him, my lawyers advised me I have a lien, and he says, oh, yeah, I brought some money. I'll give you some money. Doesn't provide the money. Doesn't even explain, what amount of money he's going to give and what the arrangement is, and just says, give me those cows. And she's like, this doesn't make any sense. You're saying you're going to provide proof of ownership. You're not providing proof of ownership. You're saying we have this lien, we can work it out, and we can take it off the cost of the cows, and we can work out some deal. But you're also doing none of those things and just saying, give me the cows. Like, that makes no sense. And so Matt Albert calls up Trooper Mazurk, eventually investigator Stephen Herod, who's a subordinate of Thomas Gibbons. This is a guy who works for Scott Gregson's brother-in-law. In other words, the rancher's brother-in-law subordinate is the one who ultimately does most of the work in this case under the supervision of Scott Gregson's brother-in-law. They have this email exchange. There's just a stunning email exchange where Matt Albert is trying to tell this investigator, look, this is very clear. Under the law, you need to provide proof of ownership. The quote that we were going to use at court is, this is a direct quote from the email, never in a million years, quote, never in a million years would I allow a shelter or a sanctuary to release an animal to someone without any proof of ownership, because that's how animals get abused. That's literally what Matt Albert, very sensibly, as a former prosecutor himself, who had been involved in animal custody and shelter disputes legally for many years, advised his client and told Stephen Herod. And also, he says, there's not a shred of evidence. This is a direct quote, shred of evidence. There doesn't seem to be a shred of evidence that these cows actually are owned by Scott Gregson. Because they haven't even described the cows at this point. They just said, they're 2 cows. We want those 2 cows. It's like, all right, I mean, you can come up to me and say, like, you want my laptop, but there's got to be some label. You got to provide some basis for it. You can't just, that's literally theft. If you just run up to someone and said, give me your stuff, and you say, why? Said, I'm not telling you why. Give me your stuff. That is literally theft, right? You cannot just go up and take someone else's stuff, in this case, 2 cows, without any basis for it. That is illegal. You can't do that. And so Matt Albert sensibly points this out and says, there's not a shred of evidence. Never in a million years should Tracy release these cows, because that's how animals end up getting abused. And Stephen Herod comes up with this extremely nonsensical cockamamie explanation, basically alleging that because there's no evidence that Scott Gregson had a damaged fence, that he was at fault for the apparent escape of his cows, that Tracy had no legal rights. Which makes no sense. It's like there's no allegation by Tracy that Scott had a damaged fence. Whether there was a damaged fence or not is irrelevant to whether the proof of ownership had been established, whether Tracy had a lien. It's completely irrelevant. Yet Herod who's not a lawyer himself and is not making any sense, he cannot get over the fact that Scott Gregson didn't have a damaged fence. And the important point here is not only is Stephen Herod focused on the fact that, it can't be the case that Scott Gregson is responsible because he didn't have a damaged fence. Stephen Herod ignores the fact that over the last few years, there have been repeated instances where Gregson himself has conceded his cows have escaped. His kids opened up a gate. He left the gate open. Maybe his fence was damaged. Anyways, the fence damage is irrelevant. There's no proof of ownership. There's no money provided to satisfy the lien. And Matt Albert says, I've advised my client, don't return these cows. Never in a million years. That's a direct quote. And they have some emails they go back and forth, and Matt Albert's like just basically waiting for them to respond. And their response 1 week after Scott Gregson visits on July 25th is, first, Scott Gregson and his supporters, including a livestock tycoon by the name of Forrest Lucas. Somehow this guy, Forrest Lucas, who's a livestock tycoon, he runs the company Lucas Oil. His name is literally on the Indianapolis Colts and NFL team in Indiana. In fact, my NFL team when I was growing up in Indiana, the stadium is called Lucas Oil Stadium, one of the biggest automobile oil companies in the nation. It has this organization called Protect the Harvest that starts posting about this case incessantly, calling it a case of vegan extremism. Vegan extremism, because someone is merely asserting their constitutional rights, trying to protect the welfare of cows who stray and come onto their property. Scott Gregson and Forrest Lucas, who somehow decides this is his cause of the week, they drum up massive political opposition to what Tracy's doing. I won't say massive. It wasn't that massive. It's just extremely motivated. All the farmers in the area start protesting outside of Tracy's home, threatening her, screaming at her, posting on Facebook they're going to murder her. There are emails and messages all over Facebook where people are saying things like, I'm going to string you up behind that tree. I've got a shotgun and I got some bullets, and guess who they're designated for? Awful things, disgusting things. And it all culminates in a protest on July 31st, 2022, where over 100 people are outside of her home, literally looking like they're going to stampede the place and burn the place down, screaming, lock her up, lock her up. One guy on a motorbike drives onto her property and does a circle on her lawn and drives off. And the state police, and Tracy's terrified by this. She calls the police and says, oh my God, there's 100 people. There's someone on my property. They're screaming, lock her up. And I don't even know who these people are. And they're trespassing. And the officers do absolutely nothing. They do nothing. Oh, I should correct myself. The officer they designate to come back out is the same officer who went with Gregson to the property originally, the guy who harassed her originally, Andrew Mazurek. He's the guy they designate when Tracy calls the police and says, hey, I've got this mob out here and they're screaming, lock me up, and driving onto my property, and they got megaphones and they're shaking their fists and screaming at basically everybody who comes onto the property. At one point, they actually had an injured animal they were trying to bring to the vet, and they blocked Tracy from leaving the sanctuary on that day. The mob blocked her. They surrounded the trailer and blocked her from taking an animal to receive emergency veterinary care. And who do they send to try and address this? Andrew Mazurek, the same cop that accompanied Scott Gregson on the initial encounter, that initial surprise encounter. And Andrew Mazurek, when Tracy says, I'm terrified, there's a bunch of people, they're screaming, lock me up. They literally blocked me from trying to get an animal to emergency care, which is unlawful. You cannot trap someone in their own home and block their car, right? That's totally illegal. Andrew Mazurek, his response is, if you want me to do anything, you have to come confront the crowd. He says, come out to the front, because she's in the back of her property, basically hiding. And she says, no, I can't do that. These people are trying to kill me. They're literally threatening to kill me. There's someone coming onto my property, driving on my lawn. And there's video footage of this, right? It's wild. Andrew Mazurek drags Tracy out to the front, and she eventually concedes and says, all right, if this is the only way you're going to do something about this, I'll come to the front with you. And they all start screaming in unison, lock her up, lock her up, lock her up. 100 voices on megaphones, huge signs, free the cows, which is ironic because they didn't want to free the cows. They wanted to kill the cows. Lock her up. And Mazurek does absolutely nothing. He says, there's no property damage, right? It's wait, they just trapped this woman in her own home. They just drove onto her lawn. And there's no requirement there has to be property damage when someone falsely imprisoned you on your own home. So he does nothing. They send her back up. She basically stands there, gets humiliated and screamed at by over 100 people. And it seemed to me like the officer was basically trying to subject her to some sort of medieval punishment and drag her out to the front yard. She goes back to her property. The officer does nothing. And she's sitting there. She calls Matt Albert and says, gosh, we have to do something about this. Can we negotiate a resolution quickly? Matt Albert's still waiting for a response from Stephen Herod. And how do the authorities respond? They respond 2 days later by showing up with 6 state police officers in 2 cars, and they arrest and shackle and jail Tracy. They don't address any of her claims, the legal claims she has to the cows, the claims she has against the protesters who falsely imprisoned her on her own property to prevent her from leaving to give aid to a sick animal who ultimately died. That animal died at a veterinarian, and maybe, I don't know, but maybe it contributed. I mean, I can't imagine it didn't contribute at least to her suffering. The fact that she was trapped on the sanctuary by a mob of people prevented her from leaving to receive veterinary care. They didn't address, at least initially, ultimately they claimed they addressed the case of the guy driving onto a property and running over a lawn and screaming obscenities at her. Instead, they arrest her. And guess who's there leading that arrest warrant and raid? Thomas Gibbons, Scott Gregson's brother-in-law. The brother-in-law, unconstitutionally and illegally, shows up on that day in violation of Public Law 74 in the state of New York and is leading the raid to help his brother-in-law. Yeah, it's mind-blowing. So they arrest and shackle her. They throw her into jail. I've talked to many criminal defense attorneys in a larceny case. Louis Massari, who's a great local attorney, helped us out in this case. He said, I frankly had murder cases where we don't have inmates shackled by their legs, because she's not only handcuffed, but she's shackled by her legs, thrown in jail, hauled in front of a court, accused of very serious crimes, and gagged unconstitutionally, told she cannot make any social media posts at all. Not just social media posts about this case, she cannot make any social media posts at all. And despite the fact that there's been a mob of people outside of her home, trespassing on her property, trapping her there, screaming, lock her up. People are posting that they're going to come to her house and murder her. They post a gag order against her saying she has been threatening Gregson. It's wild. It's absolutely wild. And it's an example of how the law bends to power, not just the power of influence and relationship and connection. The fact that Gregson was the brother-in-law of a senior officer in the state police, the fact that he was an officer himself, but also the power of money. The fact that there are very powerful moneyed interests like Forrest Lucas who are trying to caricature this case as a case of, quote, vegan extremism. And lo and behold, even a federal congresswoman, a woman by the name of Claudia Tenney, who's sadly, one of our 435 representatives in the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C., did a press conference a few months later condemning vegan extremism in Niagara County. And it's like the women taking a stray cow in merely exercising her very fundamental constitutional rights as a vegan extremist, while the mob outside screaming obscenities lock her up, trapping a woman in her own home, driving across her front lawn, threatening to hang her on her tree, threatening to come to her home with a shotgun and shoot her to death. Those people are totally rational and good, upstanding citizens, and Tracy Murphy is a vegan extremist who needs to be stopped. It is like a bizarre world where up has become down and left has become right. And over the last 2 years, Tracy has been gagged. She's not even able to tell her own story because she was barred for the first, I won't say for 2 years. I think it was about 6 months, maybe a year before we lifted the gag order. She was unconstitutionally gagged on the basis of a snowflake claim by Mr. Gregson that he had faced death threats. I have no doubt that someone has said something mean to Scott Gregson. This is a large, armed man who is part of the state police, who has the ability to mobilize half a dozen armed men and a bunch of other men to raid someone's house unconstitutionally, arrest them and throw them in jail and shackle them. At the same time that he's claiming he's in fear of his life, he's making all sorts of ridiculous posts about how beef so good, radicalized vegans will try to steal from you. Mocking animal sanctuaries as places of greed and hate, places where people are risking everything, their own money, their own emotional well-being to help sick and starving animals, assisting the local community to do this in many cases, as Tracy had, calling them places of greed and hate. He is posting constantly about this and getting in fights on social media that he starts and then blaming Tracy for them because she did one live stream where she suggested to people to contact McKee Farms, which is a public Facebook page. A public business Facebook page, right? You can still find it today. McKee Farms, they used to have their phone number on their page. They took it down. Apparently because Scott Gregson was saying all sorts of naughty, random stuff. And apparently some people called. And Tracy's the one who's gagged. Okay. So that's where we are on August 2nd. She gets thrown in jail, charged with grand larceny, subject to a penalty. I believe it's up to 7 years imprisonment. She's gagged. And here's kind of the final straw. The final straw is immediately on July 26, 2022, even before Tracy was arrested. And then in September of 2022, about a month after Tracy was arrested, she gets some attorneys, some local attorneys, who say over and over again from the start, Tracy's number one concern, both from an evidentiary and legal perspective and from moral perspective, is finding out what happens to these cows. Because on the same day she's arrested, Scott Gregson's trailer shows up. Police load the cows into the trailer. And even though the arrest warrant directs the officers to bring the cows to court, because the cows are evidence in a criminal case and they have to be preserved. Even though the evidence should have been preserved for Tracy and her lawyers to inspect, they take the cows back to Gregson, and we learn a couple years later the cows were sent off to slaughter. It's an awful story because Tracy didn't discover this until a couple months ago when the New York Times reported on this case and said the cows were sent off to slaughter. But that was highly inappropriate as well. Maybe because the brother-in-law was leading this investigation instead of retaining this evidence, which officers are required to do legally and constitutionally in every case. They just send the animals directly back to Gregson, who slaughters them and doesn't give the defense even a chance to challenge ownership. Which is the entire point of the case from day one, that Tracy wanted proof of ownership. She never received proof of ownership. She never did before she was arrested. Because while they're deliberating with Tracy's lawyers about proof of ownership, instead of actually providing proof of ownership, they just show up, arrest and jail her, and take her cows and kill them. But the key thing is from day one, her lawyers, including me, made requests saying we need to see these cows. Under the automatic disclosure laws of the state of New York, under the Constitution of the United States, we have a right to see these cows. We have a right to inspect them. And the only evidence that the state provides, they keep basically saying, oh, yeah, we're inquiring about their location. We don't know exactly where they are. We'll look into them. Maybe they're sold, maybe they weren't. They never give us a straight answer. But the only evidence they give us is one, a description by Mr. Gregson. And he says, okay, I know these are my cows, and I can prove these are my cows because I had a 14-pound, 100-pound black heifer, a black female cow, and a 700-pound goldenish brown steer. And what do the cows at Tracy's sanctuary look like? They don't match that description. The black 1,400-pound heifer, which is a slaughter weight heifer, a slaughter weight Angus steer, and not a fully grown cow, because an Angus steer can get up to 2,000 pounds, but pretty close, 1,400 pounds. This is like a near adult-sized cow. It's slaughter weight, so about 18 to 24 months, an Angus heifer or steer will be slaughtered. They're usually around 1,400 pounds, sometimes more. This cow is Little Willow, the cow that Tracy has named Little Willow. Do you remember there's Big Willow and Little Willow? Well, Little Willow is a tiny little cow. She's basically a little, she's larger than a calf. She's not a little baby, but she's a juvenile cow. And so Gregson is saying, I got these two cows. One of them is twice as big as the other one, and one of them is slaughter weight, ready to go to slaughter. And instead, you got two cows, one of which is not goldenish brown, but dark brown, another that's black. And they're not twice as large as one another, but they're both little babies. So the description doesn't even match up. He also provides some receipts from February of 2021 and October 2021, which once again just do not match up. They don't match the cows, because he is saying a black heifer calf that he bought in February of 2021 was about 600 pounds. And the video footage from Tracy's sanctuary, if you look at the comparison of the size of the animals and the black heifer in July of 2022, a year and a half after this receipt was written, shows approximately 600-pound cow. So under Gregson's theory of ownership, this cow purchased in February of 2021 somehow managed to not grow at all in a year and a half. Yes, she looks completely healthy. She's not starved. She's not some like emaciated, starved cow in July of 2022. But somehow, under Gregson and the prosecution's theory, this receipt from February of 2021 for a cow who's 600 pounds in February of 2021, and the receipt says 600 pounds, somehow remains the same exact weight in July of 2022. So these are pretty glaring inconsistencies, right? The way I put it to our legal team, it's like someone says, "Oh yeah, I have LeBron James' wallet, or I know LeBron James," and they keep pointing at this person. They said, "Yeah, LeBron James," and they're pointing to Simone Biles, like a tiny, 5-foot tall gymnast who's about 100 pounds. LeBron James is like an NBA star. It's like over 200 pounds, big, huge guy, 6'8", and they keep pointing to Simone Biles and saying, "Yeah, that's my friend LeBron James," and you're like, bro, that's not LeBron James. That's Simone Biles. You got the wrong person. And you'd also start doubting everything they're saying, because if someone lies to you about that, you're like, what are you talking about? That's not LeBron. That's Simone Biles. You're out of your mind. And this is the evidence the prosecution brings for proof of ownership. Like, after we beg and plead and say, how do you even know these are Gregson's cows? This is the best they provide. So this is where we are. And the worst part about all this, they provide a description that doesn't match the cows. They provide receipts that don't match the cows. And mysteriously, even though we asked them immediately after, and frankly, even before the seizure of the cows, on July 26, 2022, Matt Albert is already saying, give me proof of ownership. I want to know exactly how you know these are the right cows. We want to be able to match the cows against your descriptions, match the cows against any evidence you have, receipts, photos, whatever it is. But instead of giving us that evidence and allowing us to compare the cows, they sent the cows to be destroyed, to be killed. So we can't even compare the cows to the descriptions anymore. We have no way to prove the cows were in fact 600 to 700 pound cows, not 1,400 pound cows. We have no way to prove that this cow was we have no way to prove that we're talking about Simone Biles and LeBron James. It's like someone said, oh, my good friend's Simone Biles, or my good friend's LeBron James, and they're pointing Simone Biles, and someone just kidnapped the both of them, they disappeared from the face of the earth. And so you can't prove who was who. You can't prove who was pointing at whom. You can't prove anything because the cows have disappeared. They've been killed. And for 2 years, we've been fighting and begging and pleading under the automatic disclosure laws of the state of New York, under the federal constitutional rights my client had under a Supreme Court case called Brady versus United States, where the prosecution has a legal and constitutional obligation to provide evidence in this case that is exculpatory. And certainly the identity of the cows and the fact that there are fundamental inconsistencies between the descriptions being provided to us and the actual cows in this case, that's pretty exculpatory. That's pretty important for our case. And lo and behold, just like the text messages, just like the relationship between Gregson and his brother-in-law, just like almost all the important evidence in this case, somehow it just disappears. It's not disclosed. And we learned a couple months ago from the New York Times, not from the prosecution directly, from the New York Times, the cows have been sent to slaughter and killed. So this is where we are. And I have to say, for 2 years, we've been litigating and fighting this and raising these issues. And for 2 years, judges have ignored all the fundamental breaches of legal ethics, violations of law, violations of the U.S. Constitution that were apparent in this case. And I think one of the reasons that has been true is because our legal system just does not actually respect the rule of law. I hate to say this, but it is my experience that our legal system falls so far short of the U.S. Constitution as it's written on various pieces of paper that it's like we don't have a constitution at all. And I'm not exaggerating. I mean, I've talked to so many people whose fundamental constitutional rights have been violated because of this sort of kinship relationship, because of the effect of money. The animal cruelty laws in the state of California are flagrantly and wildly violated left and right by factory farmers, and no one cares. No one is even willing to have a conversation about it. And when you do have a conversation with them, they tell you, they concede, yes, these seem to be all violations of the law. We will do nothing, right? That is not the rule of law. That is not the rule of law. That is a rule of money and power. And that is what unfolded in this case. But the good thing is, Tracy, in this case, had a great defense team that was willing to litigate this case and ready to vindicate Tracy's rights in a court of law. And over the last couple of days, we started presenting all this evidence to the judge in this case. And this is a judge who, by all accounts, is deeply embedded in the local community, not a lawyer. Town of Wheatfield is the town that's addressing this case because it was actually moved from the town of Newfane because 2 judges needed to be recused because of their relationships with various parties in this case. This is a judge who, over and over again, to me, demonstrated, frankly, bias. May not be conscious bias, although in this case, I think it was conscious bias. He went on the record basically saying, I love the state police, I love the prosecutor in this case, while, not saying not so nice things about me throughout the case. But even this judge, in the face of this overwhelming mountain of evidence of violations of state law and constitutional rights, ultimately made an evidentiary ruling on October 2nd, just 2 days ago, that the state, in light of the destruction of evidence, in light of the numerous violations of law in this investigation, the state would not be able to use evidence relating to the 2 cows. And it was kind of a curious ruling because he didn't outright dismiss the case, which is what we're asking for. He made a ruling saying evidence of the cows needed to be excluded. But of course, in a case where you're trying to prosecute someone for stealing 2 cows, it's hard to prosecute that case without talking about 2 cows. So we made the very sensible statement to the judge on October 2nd. Look, Your Honor, this case can't proceed. But the prosecution refused to dismiss the case initially. We went back into court yesterday, and the prosecution made a statement saying we disagree with the judge's ruling. Didn't explain the reasoning because there is no reasoning. There's no legal grounds upon which they can seek a reversal of the judge's decision, but we're not going to move forward with the case. And the case is ultimately dismissed. So I said to you there's a bigger point in all this, and this is a huge victory for the animals, for the record. Even though technically this is an evidentiary ruling, this is a huge victory for the animals, and here's why. In this case, we had enormous power and influence, the state police, a supervisor, a kinship relationship, a livestock tycoon, Forrest Lucas, a federal congresswoman condemning vegan extremism. You had so many forces going up against one woman who was simply trying to do the right thing by giving aid to 2 stray animals. And the reason this is a crucial political precedent is because in spite of all of that, Tracy Murphy stood up for her rights and she won. She won. Her rights have been vindicated. And frankly, this might not be the end of the case for various reasons that I won't get into now. And what that shows fundamentally, and I think this is actually why the case is dismissed, is even in upstate New York, even a very conservative agricultural farming community, the prosecution and the judge recognized if we actually had the opportunity to tell the actual story of what unfolded in New Fane, New York in July and August of 2022, a jury would have revolted against these facts, would have acquitted her in 15 minutes. Because the notion that the state police can use kinship relationships to bully a local woman, the notion that the state police can violate the law, call the SPCA in against the explicit instructions of the boss, against the SPCA policies, can violate your legal rights under lien laws, under animal cruelty laws, to protect an animal from cruelty, to kill an animal who is a companion animal, a domestic animal living near your home who's not being raised for commercial or subsistence purposes. The notion that powerful interests could get away with all these legal and ethical breaches of trust, they realized this case would have no jury appeal, but they were going to lose a trial. And if we can win in a case like that, where there's so many powerful interests going up against, frankly, me and Justin, and we're not wealthy people with billions of dollars. We don't have enormous political influence in upstate New York, connections with Congress people and tycoons and sheriffs and men with guns. The fact that we can win this case in upstate New York means we can win cases across the nation, which is why it's become even more important for people to assert their rights to rescue animals from abuse. And one of the reasons we started this Simple Heart, one of the reasons I have this podcast and now YouTube show, one of the reasons Justin Marceau started the Animal Activist Defense Project is because we need people to exercise their rights. We need people to stand up, not just for the law, which is important enough. I mean, hopefully people believe the Constitution actually matters. And so, for example, if there's a Brady violation and the defense is not being given evidence that someone's innocent, there actually is some accountability in the system, but also for animals. If we don't use the Constitution or other legal rights to protect animals, we can't protect animals effectively. And the lesson of this case is if you do and you have the right lawyers, you can win. And so I hope that's what all of you take home. It has been a wild journey over the last 2 years. Myself, I've been through, I don't even know how many criminal cases myself while I've been trying to defend Tracy. I was disbarred twice. Well, actually, once in this time period. I think it was disbarred once before I took on Tracy's case, and then once on an interim basis. And thankfully, it was reversed, which is one of the reasons I was able to represent her at trial. And I'll tell you this story on some future occasion about the judge's curious look at me when I showed up in court again, because I had to provide notice that I was disbarred, and then I provided notice that I had been reinstated. And he looked at me like, "What are you doing in my courtroom?" And when I saw the DA for the first time after I came back to this case, she looked like she'd seen a ghost. She looked at me and was like, it's pretty wild. But the important point, again, is you got to stand up for your rights and got to stand up for the animals' rights. And if you do, we can win. Okay? All right. There's a lot more I could say, but I got to head over to Asha's Farm Sanctuary. I'm sorry I'm not dressed up in my normal shirt and suit, but I've got to rush off to Asha's Farm, which is, what I'm planning to do. But thank you all so much for the support. Thank you all for everything you've done for the animals to follow this show. I hope to have a conversation maybe with Tracy, maybe with Justin Marceau, maybe with another attorney about this case. You'll hear more stories about this case in the next couple of weeks. But hit that subscribe button. Make sure you share. And until next time, keep fighting for the animals. All right? Thanks, everybody. We don't have to hurt animals. You can protect them. We don't have to kill them. We can care for them. And that's who we're meant to be, right? That's who we are when we're at our best. We're caring for each other and for the other living beings of this earth and not hurting them.